Yeah, today we are meeting under the framework of PRODEC seminar. Project, I'm sorry. PRODEC is on its full name, Protecting the Rights of Destitute Mobile EU Citizens. It's FEANTSA's project supported by the European Programme for Integration and Migration, under which we have conducted for the past 2 years our work in relation to freedom of movement. And the objective of the project has been to create a sense of urgency at the European political level on the topic of homelessness among mobile EU citizens. We have done this in the past 2 years through a series of activities, and one of them has been a data collection on the situation from the ground, which we are going to present here today with the partner organizations that Sergio has mentioned. Before passing the floor to our partners to present the results from the reports they wrote, I will just take a couple of more minutes to give a brief overview of who was included in these reports. So as you can see in this table, for the report in Brussels in 2020, we have a number of 314 people who were surveyed. Of course, just to mention that for Brussels, we also have 2 previous reports referring to the years 2018 and 2019, which can be found on FEANTSA website. In Stockholm, we have seen indeed an impact of the pandemic on the number of the people who have reached the services of Crossroads. But despite this, our partners were able to survey a number of 51 individuals who are included in the report. And for Münster in Germany, we had a number of 100 respondents, while in Barcelona, there were 99 people included in the report. For the ages of the respondents surveyed, we can see that the reports on Brussels and Stockholm have higher percentages for the age groups of 40 to 49 and 50 to 59 years. In Münster, the higher percentages are for the group ages of 29 to 38 and 39 to 48. While in Barcelona, the highest percentages are for 36 to 45 and 46 to 55. In terms of gender, in most reports, we can see, well, except for Münster, we can see a higher presence of men in the surveys. But of course, here we do have to mention the aspect of hidden homelessness, which we know that is experienced more often by women. So these percentages need to be understood while keeping this aspect in mind. And finally, in terms of nationality, I will just briefly mention that the countries from where most mobile EU citizens come are indeed Romania, Poland, and Bulgaria, but we do also see a presence of people coming from Italy or France or Slovakia. So this was the short overview I had prepared. And now I will just stop sharing my screen and invite colleagues from DIOGENES and Bruss'help to start their presentation. Actually, we will start with Bruss'help from Brussels. Here we have Mauro Striano, who is an advisor at Bruss'help, which is the organization responsible, among other things, for coordinating homeless services in the Brussels capital region. And Mauro will present the situation of homelessness among mobile EU citizens in Brussels. We will find out more about the obstacles to accessing rights for mobile EU citizens who are homeless. Mauro, if you can share your screen.
Okay, can you see the screen in question? Do you see the presentation, Simona?
Yes, you just need to go in full screen.
Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, so Thanks for the invitation. My name is Mauro Striano. So I'll present some of the data, part of the data related to the studies. So first of all, the study, it was already reminded by Simona. The objective was really to collect not only quantitative, but also qualitative data about homeless mobile citizens, or in general, homeless and also poorly housed mobile citizens in Brussels. This is the third time that we do that. So as Simone already explained, we had a study related to the data collected by DIOGENES in 2018 and 2019. The third report will be soon published, probably in January. And there is the question, the first question that we have to ask ourselves is really the question of to which extent is this study representative of the whole homeless population? And one of the answers that we can give, to do that, we need to relate the data that we have in the database of DIOGENES with the data that we have as Bruss'help, which is basically data that we collect every 2 years through a homeless count. So in DIOGENES, DIOGENES accompanied 314 mobile citizens in 2020. And when we compare, especially the number of rough sleepers, we have like 112 rough sleepers who are mobile citizens, of which 26 were sleeping in encampments. And we can relate that to the total number of people we counted in the streets, which is 719, which means that we have around 15% of the, to be scientifically correct, we didn't collect the data on the same date, but more or less like the homeless count was carried out the second week, the beginning of November. The data that we have in the database of DIOGENES is related to the end of the year, so it's more or less the same period. And in general, DIOGENES accompanied 198 rough sleepers in 2020, which is around almost, let's say, 30% of the rough sleeper population in Brussels. And almost 50% of them were mobile citizens. So we cannot know exactly which is the number of mobile citizens who are rough sleepers in Brussels, but we can probably say that there are a few hundreds of them. So it's we can assume that it's very representative in terms of people who are sleeping rough, but when we look, for instance, at people in emergency accommodation or in shelters, we can see that this is less represented. So we have around 1% for the two categories. So, okay, to conclude, I think that the study is very representative in relation to people who are sleeping rough, much less when we look at the access for services. And we will know, we will see the reasons later on in the presentation. So, so in this presentation, I won't explain all the things, all the findings of the reports, because there are many. We decided to focus on the question of access to rights, and access to rights is related to the access to administrative status, to a residence permit. And so it is worth remembering what is like in the EU law, and particularly in Directive 2004/38, what is the main condition to register. So in the directive, for periods of residence longer than 3 months, the host member states might require union citizens to register with the relevant authorities. And registration certificates shall be issued immediately, stating the name and address of the person registering and the date of the registration. There is no explicit request of having an address, but in reality, and this is the case in Belgium, which requires to register within 3 months of the arrival in Belgium, you need a postal address. And when you are homeless, you don't have an address. There are possibilities for homeless people. Basically, they can have a reference address in shelters. it's possible in some shelters, but to have access to a shelter, so you need an income, and most of the people that we are taking into account in the study, they don't have an income. So you need a residence permit, basically. And we are talking about people who don't have a residence permit, or you can also have a reference address in a public social service center. But again, you need to be regular residing. So the result is that most of the people that that are included in this database, they actually without an address. So we have more than 50% of people who don't have an address. And the proportion of those who have a reference address is very low. It's 3.5%. And if we look at that sample, we will see that just a few of them are rough sleepers. So if you don't have an address, you don't have a residence permit, which is one of the most important things, but also you don't have access to services, except of course, emergency accommodation and emergency healthcare. So these services include shelters, as I already mentioned, but also employment services, like for instance, there is even like a service provided by OBO for homeless people in order to have access to the labor market, but they can't work with mobile citizens who are irregular residing. And also there is the question of accessing a bank account. So basically, people don't have access to a bank account because they don't have an address. And sometimes that also is an obstacle to have to find a job, because you need a bank account in order to sign a contract. So, well, the main obstacle also related to the fact that you don't have an address is you cannot have a residence permit. And in the sample that we are taking into account, so out of 314 people, 63% of them, they are irregular residing. We have around 20%, a little bit more than 20% who have a residence permit, of which half have a e-card, so the 5 years permit, and the other 50% have the E+ card, so for people who are residing for more than 5 years. But basically, so the access to residence permit is let's say, not a possibility for them. And very quickly, the fact that people don't have an administrative status has a strong impact on several factors related to living conditions. And here I decided just to focus on 3 of these living conditions. Sleeping rough, so as we can see in blue, people who are irregularly residing are very vulnerable to sleeping rough, more than 40%, almost 50%. And we can see that for people who have a residence permit, this proportion decreases quite a lot, quite significantly. So people who have a 5 years permit have around 10%, only 10% are people sleeping rough. The same goes for long-term permit. And the same goes for the other living condition we are taking into account. So the fact, the possibility to have a legal income is almost impossible for people who are irregular residing. And we see that for people who have a residence permit, it's just, well, it's still quite a lot, 20% for those who have a 5 years permit, but for the long-term permit, it's around 4 or 5%. So it's much less. And the same goes to have access to a full medical insurance. So, well, to conclude, the fact that people don't have an address, the fact that they don't have a residence permit has a strong impact on the main living conditions. So they are much more vulnerable to be rough sleepers, to not have a legal income, and to not have a medical insurance. And pass over to Andrea.
Thank you,
How
Mauro.
do I do that? No, how do you do that? Sorry, I'm just trying to stop my. Oh, right, there you go. Yep.
Everyone. So Simona, I'll be relying on you to show
yes.
the couple of slides we've prepared. I hope everyone hears me fine or sufficiently at least. Um, all right, so yeah, here we are. So good morning, everyone. So indeed, Mauro provided you with parts of the data Diogen collected in 2020, focusing on intra-European migrants and part of the interpretation. Now, the data highlights the link between the administrative status or lack thereof and the difficulty in accessing decent permanent housing, as well as some type of legal income. I will now focus on anchoring this in the reality of the field, as well as providing some recommendations from our point of view. Now, let me first briefly remind you of the most striking numbers from last year. And all the data we are presenting today was collected by our team of street workers and rendered anonymous. In 2020, Diogen worked with 869 people overall. Of those, 314 were mobile EU citizens, which represent 40% of our public in Brussels. Among those, 56% have been in Belgium for more than 5 years, and from that group, 55 still do not have a right of residence. From our figures, we can also underline the difficult living condition of this group. Now, indeed, 47 of intra-European migrants are homeless, meaning that they're either sleeping rough or in and out of emergency services, and only 26% of them have a legal income. The pandemic of COVID-19 has sometimes greatly affected the living conditions of the mobile EU citizens. Mainly, we saw an impact on their mobility and their sources of income. During the weeks of lockdown, the most vulnerable people who counted on begging as their sole income or on other informal revenues, such as sex work or undeclared work, were even further impoverished. This data leads us to the conclusion that although the European law on free movement of persons might suggest that people can travel within the European Union without needing proof of future employment or proof of money to live off, this is indeed only true for the first 90 days of the stay. So Mauro said that, but I think it's important to say that once again, if one wishes to stay over that 3-month period, they need either proof of lawful employment, proof of self-employment, or proof of sufficient resources, so as not to become what is described as a burden to the state. So clearly accessing one's rights is key in improving overall living condition. Many migrants are stuck in a catch-22 with no income means no housing means no registered job, no job means no money means no home, and so on, the cycle continues. This situation is well known to those working with migrants, but it rings especially true when talking about intra-European migrants. Now, as Mauro pointed out, one way of breaking the vicious cycle is to be able to find housing and thus to have a postal address. This may sound easy, but for people coming from poorer member state without much resources, it can prove to be nearly impossible. This is why housing with ad hoc support is crucial. However, accessing housing, permanent or temporary, does not guarantee that this vicious cycle will break. Often there are other difficulties. And also, it's important to understand that projects such as Housing First are not really suited to this public for several reasons, but mostly because they're aimed at people who are legally residing in Belgium. In order to find better solutions for mobile EU citizens, it is necessary to work alongside other organizations across different sectors. Diogen has been involved in 2 projects that focus on trying to break the vicious cycle we're talking about. So first, since early 2020, several key partners, including Diogen, have developed a project aimed at social inclusion through temporary individual housing and the tailored social support. This innovative project was born from the desire to propose an alternative that would complement existing services for the homeless. The project is named Issue, and it seizes the opportunity of empty buildings awaiting renovation to allow homeless people to settle there for a period of at least 6 months. By creating the possibility of domiciliation and free access to services, it allows to unblock administrative situations and sometimes even get access to the labor market. It also allows temporary rest and respite for people who have been living rough for however long. In January 2022, another cross-sector project will start, funded by the European Commission. Rights First, as the name suggests, will focus on helping people to obtain a legal status in Belgium or to get their administrative status in order, and in parallel, finding housing and employment or training opportunities. We have seen that mobile EU citizens living in poverty and homelessness need different types of support in order for them to try and improve their situations. Moreover, they need the correct information delivered to them in a way they can understand. A lot of people coming from different EU countries looking for a better life, better employment, healthcare, education, etc., don't speak French or Dutch or not fluently enough, but many organizations don't have workers fluent in those languages. One of the ways Diogenes addresses this problem is by working with intercultural mediators. With the goal of social inclusions, it aims to specifically address the needs of homeless people who face socioeconomic, language, and/or cultural barriers. Currently, we have both dedicated Roma and Polish intercultural mediators, and they are the ones who mainly work with the citizens coming from Poland and the different Roma communities. As intercultural mediators, they are the link between both languages and both cultures. They must know intimately both, and meaning both the surface culture, as you can see at the top of the iceberg in the slides, but most importantly, the deep cultures, meaning the fundamental values and viewpoints, the communication styles and rules, etc. The Roma and Polish people we meet today in the framework of this intercultural mediations are subject to many stereotypes and prejudices. Excluded from our society, they're often victims of discrimination, and as time goes by, we notice that they tend to exclude themselves. They don't ask for help because they think it's not adapted, or they don't even know it exists, or they prefer to self-isolate in order to protect themselves. Too often, intra-European migrants are left to their own devices and do not have neither the knowledge nor the strength to take all the necessary steps. Now, this also raises the questions of thresholds of access. This is why Diogenes' mission is to reach out to them, to inform them of their rights and duties, to direct them to the appropriate services, to raise awareness in order to deconstruct stereotypes about them, and to initiate discussions with other actors who might feel powerless or frustrated due to a lack of mutual understanding. All of our actions aim at the better living together, a good coexistence of each of the persons concerned. Now, this year, intercultural mediation has been identified by FEANTSA as one of the 16 good practices to support the social inclusion of mobile EU citizens. Now, as a conclusion, I will say that by implementing good practices such as intercultural mediation and by participating alongside other key cross-sector actors in innovative projects, our aim is to both provide help, support, and guidance to people in need, and also to promote our ideal by raising awareness and creating a dialogue around the topic. Our long-standing work with homeless people, among which many destitute intra-European migrants, has allowed us not only to collect data, but also to take part in researches such as PRODEC. We hope this will provide further understanding of the specific situations and that this will aid in the adaptation of related policies. In short, we strive for the individualization and universality of rights for all people in the EU. To us, these seem to be the key elements for the defense of human rights. We advocate for a real social European Union that allows for portability of the rights from one EU country to the other, and that provides social protection to any citizen from an EU state who decides to move elsewhere in the EU. Universality of rights means that everyone should have access, no matter the administrative status in the country of residence. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Very interesting to hear from you. And just to add that Andrea is a research and development officer at DIOGENES. Thank you for that. Well, now it's time to move to our second presentation of the day, coming from Stockholm. I'd like to invite Maurizio to join us. Maurizio Dogliotti, he is a legal expert at Crossroads, which is a department of the Stockholms Stadsmission in Sweden, working to support European citizens and third country nationals who live in conditions of social or economic vulnerability. So Maurizio will focus his presentation on the issues of job seeker status, linked also to access to rights, and he will provide us more information on EU citizens who work but are unable to obtain the social security number in Sweden. The floor is yours, Maurizio. Just make sure you're unmuted, please.
Oh. Hi to everyone, and I will start to introduce our work. So, I think that to have a better understanding of problem and obstacles that many destitute EU mobile citizens face or could face in Sweden, we could start to examine 3 different topics. At the point 1 of the presentation, we will briefly examine the so-called right of residence, a crucial right stated by the Free Movement Directive, and this right is strongly linked with the possibility to register as resident in Sweden and obtain the Swedish Social Security number. We are going to mention the different conditions required by the Swedish law if the individual who wants to be listed in the Swedish population register is a European citizen or a Swedish citizen. Speaking about this topic, we will see how the different conditions requested respectively to EU citizens or Swedish citizens constitute a violation of the principle of equal treatment. At the point 2 of this presentation, we will briefly compare the extension of the right of residence in Sweden as stated by the Court of Justice of the European Union, and we are going to compare it with the Swedish Aliens Act. At the point 3 of this presentation, we will briefly see how an EU citizen who has a work in Sweden could anyway face obstacles to be listed in the Swedish population register due to the relation between the right of residence and the duration of the employment contract. So, to better understand the topics number 2 and 3, it's necessary to speak about the Social Security number, even called personal identity number, and the right of residence. The right of residence entails the EU citizens the possibility, under certain conditions, to move and legally reside in another member state for more than 3 months. EU citizens who move to Sweden do not need to register with the Swedish Migration Agency, but it's possible to register with the Swedish Tax Agency to obtain a Social Security number. A person who doesn't have a Social Security number could face several obstacles in his or her daily life, considering that the social security number is often requested by both public and private actors. The personal security number provides access to a substantial number of rights, as, for instance, healthcare and social security system in Sweden. On the other side, an individual without social security number could not be able to activate a mobile phone subscription or use online services provided from both public and private actors, as a private bank or the Swedish Social Insurance Agency. To obtain the personal security number, an individual must be registered with the Swedish Tax Agency, and the Swedish Population Registration Act rules the conditions requested to be listed in the Swedish Population Register. The first condition to be listed is that an individual is going to live in Sweden for at least 1 year. The Swedish Population Register Act rules different conditions if the individual is a EU citizen or a Swedish citizen. To be registered as resident in Sweden, according to the Swedish Population Registration Act, an EU citizen has to prove to have the right of residence for at least 1 year, while a Swedish citizen returning home after living abroad does not need to prove the right of residence. The consequence is that, compared to the Swedish citizens, the EU citizens are de facto discriminated because of their nationality. And this is a clear violation of the principle of the equal treatment that is ruled by the Article 24 of the Free Movement Directive. Now we could examine how the so-called 1-year rule affects the EU citizens who move to Sweden with the aim to look for a job and those who are working under certain conditions. According to the principle stated from the European Court, a European citizen who moves to another member state in search of work has the right of residence for the first 6 months. If after 6 months, as stated by the court, the citizen continues to search work and provides evidence that he is continuing to seek employment and he has genuine chances of being engaged, he or she will keep the right of residence. Contrary, in the Swedish Alien Act is ruled that a European job seeker has the right of residence for 6 months only if he or she has a real possibility of finding a job. While the European Court ruled that the right of residence is unconditional for the first 6 months, the Swedish Aliens Act conditions this right on the real possibility of finding work already during the first 6 months, and is extremely difficult for destitute EU citizens to demonstrate to have a real possibility of finding a job already during the first 6 months in Sweden. A destitute EU mobile citizen who moved to Sweden as job seeker is very rarely able to demonstrate that he or she has a real possibility to find a job during the first 6 months. The consequence will be that the job seeker very rarely will be able to prove his or her right of residence. The intention of European Court was certainly to facilitate the free movement of a job seeker, while the Swedish law, on the other hand, drastically reduced the possibility for a job seeker to reside in Sweden with the aim to look for work. Moreover, considering that an individual can be listed in the Swedish Population Register only if he or she can prove to have the right of residence for at least 1 year, a job seeker will never be able to prove it, because at best he or she will keep the right of residence for 6 months without having the right to be listed in the Swedish Population Register. A job seeker will never receive a social security number The combined provision of the rules that come from the Swedish Population Register Act and the Swedish Alliance Act are making it impossible for a European job seeker to be registered and to obtain the social security number. And without social security number, it will be impossible to access most rights in Sweden. This incompatible implementation of the principle affects destitute EU citizens' ability to invoke their rights as job seeker in the framework of the European law and can exacerbate the obstacles destitute EU citizens already face when trying to access the labor market in Sweden. So even European citizens who work could face obstacles anyway to obtain the social security number. The duration of a work contract is crucial to provide proof to have the right of residence for at least 1 year. Having the right of residence for at least 1 year, a European worker could be registered in Sweden and obtain the social security number. As we have already mentioned above, the tax agency requires applicant to prove the right to reside in Sweden for at least 1 year from the date of the application when assessing whether the applicant can be listed in the National Population Register and obtain the personal security number. Due to the 1 year rule, the duration of the work is crucial in proving if a person will have the right to reside in Sweden for 1 year. To have the right of residence, a worker has to be able to prove he or she will have an employment for 1 year. But to obtain a contract with so long duration is really a challenge for destitute mobile EU citizens, since they normally face specific obstacles and difficulties when assessing the Swedish labor market. EU destitute citizens are often individuals who lack specific professional skills, higher education, and even more often than necessary language skill. Due to this situation, destitute mobile EU citizens can often obtain only employment contracts that do not satisfy the 1 year requirement. According to our practical experiences, the most common contract between EU destitute citizens who made the first step in the Swedish labor market is the so-called 0 hours contract. Such contracts are used by employers to cope with sudden and temporary increases in work or to cover a temporary shortage of staff, and the working hours can vary. This is a type of contract that doesn't grant any minimum salary or, as rule, any specific duration. Since the needs of the employer change continuously, the amount of worked hours can change drastically during the time, and the Swedish tax agency normally doesn't consider this contract enough to be listed in the Swedish Population Register because it doesn't fulfill the condition of 1 year rule. The consequence will be that even a 0 hours worker cannot obtain the social security number that it's necessary to invoke most of the rights in Sweden. So, according to the Articles 3 and 4 of the Swedish Population Registration Act, an applicant can be registered as resident in Sweden only if he or she will stay in Sweden for at least 1 year, the so-called 1 year rule. If the applicant is a EU citizen, he or she must prove to have the right of residence for at least 1 year. The result is that the common provision of the rules referred to in the Aliens Act and the Swedish Population Registration Act make it virtually impossible for a European job seeker to secure their status in Sweden. But even destitute mobile EU citizens who work with a 0 hours contract are not able to fulfill the condition to secure their status in Sweden, obtaining the social security number. So our recommendation is that to continue promoting the European integration process and the links between the member states, it would be desirable for Sweden to take the necessary steps to fully implement the European law and remove these obstacles.
Okay, thank you, Maurizio, for that very interesting presentation. Next, we will be going to Germany, and I invite everyone who needs interpretation to choose the channel respectively for from German to English, because Stephanie is going to do her presentation in German. Stephanie Beckmann, she's joining us from Münster, where she works as a social counselor. She represents the Bischof-Hermann Foundation, which is a private church foundation providing numerous services, ranging from direct access to emergency accommodation to specialized services for homeless people, older people with a history of homelessness, or people with mental health needs. Stephanie, if you are ready to share your screen and...
Yes, thank you. Let me see if the screen sharing works, and then I can speak in German. Thank you. Ja, guten Tag aus Münster. Hallo, Simona, vielen Dank für die Vorstellung. Ja, ich möchte mich im Namen meiner Kolleginnen und der Bischof-Hermann-Stiftung ganz herzlich erstmal bedanken.
On behalf of the Bischof-Hermann Foundation, I say thank you for having given the opportunity to give some insight into our survey results, and for having the opportunity to have been part of this very exciting project. We learned a lot doing it. Now, my focus is as follows.
Und zwar ist das einmal Teil 1, der Zugang zum Arbeitsmarkt für die von uns befragte Personengruppe.
Dos áreas temáticas. Primero, el acceso al mercado de trabajo. Realizamos entrevistas a una serie de personas para poder analizar un poco el estatus del trabajador.
And it's also about the question, to what extent does the target group have vocational skills? And the second part has the focus on education for adults and for children. It's about access to language skills, to build up your language knowledge. And for children, it's the access to daycare centers for children and to school. We interviewed about 100 people and EU citizens in precarious living conditions, of which 61% did not have an accommodation. So entire families, maybe in emergency shelters, but all of short duration at best. And the other 39% of those surveyed had some accommodation they could call their own. Now, access to the labor market, we realized one thing. 90% of the people we talked to gave us the following reason for coming to Germany. I look for work so that I can live an autonomous life, so that I can live a better life, simply because back home in their countries of origins, they face often unemployment and homelessness. And 60% of those interviewed by us had some kind of work when we talked to them. This was during the time of the lockdown in Germany, by the way, and having that percentage was quite impressive. Final result, 18%, that's 11 people surveyed, had actually a full-time employment, and 16 people worked part-time. However, the major share had just the so-called mini jobs. I will not go into details concerning the first two groups, by the way. Just let me state the following. These are employments that are subject to statutory social insurance coverage. That means the employer and the employee give equal contributions to Social Security, which will cover unemployment insurance, health insurance, and pension. Now the next slide. The terminology, worker status. We already had some input on that. We have the European Union with its legal texts, and these are, for example, directives that need to be implemented in each individual member state. Article 45 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union tells us the following. It must be an effective employment where the person renders and provides services for another person following that person's instructions, and for that a salary is paid. And this remuneration need not fully cover the living expenses, by the way. Now, in our town of Münster, like in many other German towns and cities, it is as follows. The job centers and the immigration authorities check situations to find out, does this person enjoy the worker status? That requires currently in our town 7.5 hours of work per week and a minimum remuneration of 300 euros at least per week. We have a minimum wage of 9.50 euros, and the minimum wages as defined by the collective agreement for cleaning services is actually 11.11 euros. But if a person has this worker status, then this person is entitled to enjoy freedom of movement. They have access to accommodation, to shelters, to housing, and to social benefits, children's allowance, unemployment benefits, and the like. But if you do not have this worker status, and if there is no case for family reunification, then you are facing problems with regard to your residence status, and that will often entail problems with poverty, homelessness, etc. So the mini jobs are also called the 450 euro jobs, so reduced employment kind of. Typically, the following activities are involved here. We have jobs that are covered by statutory social security, and we have the mini jobs, and they come in many shapes. You may have little employment where you are paid a maximum of 450 euros per month. That may be in a private household, that may be in the context of a company, and then typical mini jobs are also affecting seasonal activities. So I'm referring myself usually to people who are below the 450 euros even, because they were the typical target group. Most of them were working in the cleaning sector, cleaning buildings. So if it's per week, 7.5 hours of work, And if the income is above 300 euros, then it's actually a good start to get into the labor market, especially if you're a person with limited language skills and with limited vocational qualifications. This is typical for many EU citizens in precarious conditions. But if you have this minimum threshold, then you can already enjoy benefits, social benefits, though the mini job in itself will not cover your living expenses, obviously. Now, mini jobs have one disadvantage. The employers and employees do not pay any contributions into social security, especially into health insurance. Certainly not the employer. He does not pay. It's left to the employee to decide if they want to pay into that. You have a difficult decision to make. Where do I use my money for? Food every day or social security coverage of a kind? There's a hot discussion relating to mini jobs in Germany, by the way, because there are many mini jobs that are not designed to be a first step towards proper employment. No, it's something where the employers see an easy solution to quickly have someone and quickly fire them. Something else that is interesting for workers that have a mini job on top of normal employment. For the mini jobs, you need not pay taxes. However, once you get beyond 450 euros a month, you pay taxes on that. Many don't want this, and the employer doesn't want to see that happen either. Hence, mini jobbers don't have an advantage if they work longer hours, and they don't have an advantage if the salary may be added or increased. So now we wanted to understand better, why is it that so many of the people interviewed by us only find mini jobs? Often their vocational qualification is limited. We surveyed 100 people and 32 people could tell us, yes, I do have a vocational qualification, but no one could have an employment that reflected that qualification. Often the case is the following: they could not show their diploma, and if there is a diploma, Germany does not necessarily recognize the validity of such a diploma. Hence, you have limits to your professional career, so you face serious obstacles. Now, my second part on the results, that is about educational aspects. First of all, language skills found among adults. 38% of the people we surveyed told us that they had good knowledge of the German language. We asked them to self-evaluate their skills: good, medium, or hardly. We gave 3 levels. Medium and hardly existing levels of knowledge meant you needed help from friends, from acquaintances, or from translators in order to get along. And though this has not been a focus question of our survey, we can conclude that there's a high level of illiterate people in this group. In consequence, there is a strong need for them to get support when they have to read text, when they have to write text. If you think of forms and applications, Germany is famous for its jungle of red tape. So it's very quickly that you may get lost there. And 25% of the people we surveyed told us that they're in a language course. It's actually a linguistic integration course. They are offered by job centers and also supported by the Federal Ministry of Immigration. Still, 25% were in a course, but 11 people could not finish the course because they needed to work or because they had no person to take care of their children. And in some cases, the format of the course was not suitable. 5 days a week, 4 hours a day, it often was too much for the people. In addition, it was the corona pandemic that led to a situation where many language courses did not take place, at least not in a physical setting, and were delivered only online, and that already created new access problems. Now, education and children. This is about reaching them early, allowing them an early access to education to enable them to find employment later down the line. Hence, you have to start with the children. And in Germany, like in other EU countries, the following option is offered. Your child can go to a day nursery or daycare center for kids. The German abbreviation is Kita. It's not mandatory to send your child to a daycare center, but as a parent, once your child is 2.5 years old, you have actually a legal right to find a place there. And the children up to the age of 6 had access to such services in daycare centers and day nurseries. So 48% of children could find a place there. It's important that that is on offer because only then the parents can do their job in an employment situation or can go to their language course. And the main problem was that they were homeless. If a family is in a municipal emergency accommodation and then maybe find accommodation or are given accommodation, but it's at a totally different district of the town, then the child is taken out of the daycare center it might have been used to already, also a problem. And now slightly older children, schooling. School attendance in Germany is mandatory. You have to send your child to a school. Our school system is highly differentiated. We have the primary schools, 4 years, and as of the 5th year, there is a multitude of schooling options. And in order to understand where it should go now, migrants need help. So most of the school-age children went to school, but 12% were not at school at the time of a survey. Main reason was homelessness again. And then we have to point out that if a family with children is homeless, so the child cannot go to a school, then no substitute schooling is offered. And on the other side, if the child does not attend, the authorities often do not look at the reasons. They come immediately with a financial fine. So this is more or less what I wanted to give you a little flavor of. Thank you very much for having listened to me and having allowed me to give a little insight into our survey results. And on behalf of our foundation, I want to mention also the following. Giving advice to EU citizens in precarious situations with regard to questions of accommodation, access to employment, access to benefits and education is a top priority for us. And I think our survey results bore that out.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, and for closing the first session of presentations, we are going to go to Barcelona next. And I'm inviting Beatriz Fernandez to tell us about the report written by Arrels team Beatriz is the head of the juridical care team in Arrels in Barcelona, which is an private foundation, that has been serving homeless people since 1987, and it offers accommodation, food, and social care and guidance to more than 2,600 people a year. Beatriz. Yes, and also to mention that Beatriz will be speaking Spanish, so again, keep the interpretation on. The floor is yours.
Buenos días. Good morning. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'm going to try to share my screen with my presentation. I hope you can see it. Perfect. Well, very briefly, before starting, I would like to briefly highlight the work that we carry out in Arrels Fundacio, and then I will present what is the reality in Barcelona, how many people sleep rough in Barcelona, and the type of services we are providing to the homeless. And then I would also like to briefly present the report that we have drafted, taking into account the survey that was carried out a year ago in November 2020, in the midst of the pandemic in Barcelona. And there we wanted to analyze mainly 4 blocks, and we will focus specifically on the impact of COVID-19 on EU citizens, mobile citizens. So, and I will present this very briefly, our conclusions. Our mission, Arrels, as Simona was saying, it is an organization that works with homeless people who find themselves in extreme phase of exclusion. So they live out in the streets, or they might be in temporary shelter at night. Our mission is to accompany them from a social point of view, but we also want to raise awareness among citizens, and we want to denounce this situation through our lobby work at a political level to demand for the rights of these people to be fulfilled. What is the current situation in Barcelona? Right now in Barcelona, we don't have official data of the people that are sleeping rough, and the data that we have more or less, well, are being updated thanks to surveys that we carry out through our organization or similar organizations, sometimes with the Barcelona Town Council, and also at an individual level. There are 1,064 people sleeping rough in Barcelona. In the graph that you can see here, we can see the profile of the city and the number of people that have been identified in the different neighborhoods. This information is important for us since it allows us to see the points where we have a higher concentration of this population of homeless people. So we have homeless people that sleep rough, and at the same time we have 3,046 people that are using resources from the city for housing, and 360 people or families in what we called settlements that are informal, for example, industrial sites that are abandoned. So they're not living individually, but together in a way collectively. What we can see in the lower graph, the number of people sleeping rough compared to 2008, we have seen has doubled, basically double. So we see an important increase in the number of people that are sleeping rough. It's quite significant. So within this increase, the number of EU citizens that are homeless, this is what has seen or experienced the most important increase of the, in general, of the homeless population, those that are sleeping rough. So what have we tried to reflect in this report? So sleeping rough in Barcelona, a snapshot of people
that are EU citizens. So we see an analysis of these people living out on the streets, and we're focusing on the results of the survey of November 6th last year. The survey was carried out based on a series of items developed by
Ziel war, auch auf die Problematik hinzuweisen, der Obdachlosigkeit, auch in Situationen der Pandemie. Wie erleben diese Personen die Pandemiesituation? Diese Kenntnisse und Erkenntnisse
políticas sociales y recursos útiles que se adapten a su realidad y que se enfoquen en conseguir que nadie
sources that are adequate for their reality so that no one has to live out on the street or sleep rough. So we were able to survey 360 people, 27% were EU citizens. In this report, we have wanted to collect the results of the 4 blocks of this analysis. The first block, there we analyze who is sleeping rough and taking into account the profile, and Simona has presented some of the data of this analysis. In the second block, we analyze the experience of the pandemic for these EU citizens that are homeless and compare to the situation before the pandemic. So what has happened with this group since the declaration of the state of alarm up to now. So we wanted to highlight the path of these people. So these people that are living right now in Barcelona, what are their itineraries? Why did they reach Barcelona? And try to identify the type of support they received. In block 4, there was an analysis of the administrative and legal situation to have a perspective that takes into account the difficulties and challenges they need to address and that do not allow them to have access to a decent housing. So administrative status is basic. It seems essential, and it's quite similar, the case of Spain, to what we have heard in previous presentations. I will briefly introduce this, of course. So when we talk about mobile EU citizens, what are we talking about? So we do have some data regarding Spain. We're talking about people that do have access to a certificate or that have a regular status with legal papers in this respect. According to the Migration Observatory, the number of foreigners in Spain is more than 5, well, basically 6 millions in December 2020. 61% are EU citizens, so mobile EU citizens. So we have a percentage that is higher in the case of mobile EU citizens when compared to Spain, except Melilla or the Basque Country, so there are some exceptions. There are 15 nationalities that represent basically 75% of all foreigners in Spain. 8 of these nationalities correspond to countries of the EU. And in Spain specifically, we would be talking about Romania and Italy, and also the UK, which is no longer part of the EU. According to the Spanish law, we see a regulation through the Royal Decree 2040 of 2007 that transposes the EU directive to the national legislation. So this Royal Decree was reformed by the Order of 1490-2012 and establishes the reasons that provide access to permanent EU residents. So if when citizens want to reside in Spain after a 3-month period, there are specific reasons that can be presented. So work, family reunification, amongst others. So what we have identified in our work is that people that are homeless, living in the streets, that are mobile EU citizens, very often cannot comply with the different reasons that are considered valid to have access to a residence permit. So the person that are homeless cannot adduce that they're studying, working, or that they're there due to family reunification. And this is what does not allow them to have their status regularized. Now focusing and being a bit more concrete on some of the aspects that I wanted to mention regarding our report. We have focused more on the way homeless people have been living through the pandemic. So the first conclusion, quite obvious for everyone, is that the pandemic has worsened the situation of homeless people. 40% of EU mobile citizens that were living in the streets said that their situation was worse. A small percentage said that the situation had improved, but we will explain why, and the others did not wish to provide an answer. So what is the context in which we find ourselves at that time in Spain? So the royal decree that I mentioned before, a royal decree established that the whole of the population needed to remain within their home to avoid the consequences of the pandemic. So this made quite evident the situation of homeless people. They cannot comply with the royal decree that decreed the lockdown. And the consequence was that very often homeless people received fines because they were out in the streets and they were not in their own home. Although these people said they were homeless and they had nowhere to go for this compulsory lockdown that was imposed in Spain. So the EU mobile citizens to which we asked this question, there was a percentage that said they had been living in Barcelona starting on March 2020. 89% men and the rest women. So we're talking mainly about men in this situation, specifically in the case of Barcelona, we're talking very often about a higher percentage of men than women. And then average age 42 years and average stay out on the streets of 4.5 months. Also, in the case of people that for the first time they found themselves homeless during the pandemic, the period of the lockdown was very difficult for them. As we can see here in the slide, it's true that there was not a high infection rate. 2% said they had COVID-19 or possible COVID-19 related symptoms. Only 31% of homeless people said that they had been tested, had undergone a PCR test, although they were considered a high-risk group. More than 89% of the surveyed people did not have access to emergency housing provided in Barcelona. 2 spaces were open for 400 people and smaller spaces for 40, 50 people. The requirements to have access to these shelters required that they could not remain or retain their belongings, and they could not have access to the shelters with an animal. And we see that very often it had been, well, when they were imposed to stay in the shelter, and they did not take duly into account these emergency housing for the people that were living out in the streets, for the homeless. Another of the problems and the issues was the lack of information for the people that were living in this situation. And this was motivated, amongst others, for the lack of access to means of communication, linguistic barriers, and lack of resources or possible access to the resources or to this information. It was very difficult. I'm sorry, well, this is in Spanish, the slide, but I hope to be able to briefly explain what you see here. As I was saying before, 40% said that the situation of the COVID-19 worsened their situation. What we wanted to reflect specifically here in this table were the main problems that they conveyed. So what were the main difficulties they had to address during the stricter months of the lockdown? The main reasons were the following. For example, they lost their sources of income or their work. So one of the realities that we had during the lockdown and after lockdown, so one of the current situations that we have right now is that before the pandemic, there was a lot of gray economy, so precarious jobs without a contract, with very bad work conditions. And very often the people with these jobs were the first that were affected by closure of businesses and shops. And therefore, for the first time, many people were made homeless without an income and without accommodation, with no housing. So the reason of being jobless or the difficulty to have access to a new job or to new income was the main reason or the main issue that was highlighted by the people we surveyed. Another of the difficulties for homeless people was the closure of the services and resources of homeless people and also of public spaces in general. One of the first measures that was adopted in this period was that not only spaces for the general population, but also spaces specifically for the homeless people were reduced. The number of people that had access was reduced, or they were closed due to the lack of material to be able to provide access to these people. So specifically at a time where the homeless population had to have more access or required more access to these services, well, specifically at this time, the services were closed. And then the lack of accommodation, the lack of housing, this is present very often. So many people lost their home, those that were in a more vulnerable situation. And then there was lack of accommodation, specifically for people that were in a more complicated situation. So it was clearly a high-risk group with health problems that could be worsened by the COVID-19. The spaces that were offered did not cover the housing need, intimacy, for example, safety, health that was specifically required in the time of the lockdown. Another difficulty was how to go through different administrative processes to have access to papers. This is what we mentioned before. So the administrative situation of EU mobile citizens is essential to be able to have access to all rights within the Spanish state. So you need to register and then in the case of EU mobile citizens to also have the residence permit. This is what provides access to different services, health services also, or healthcare in general. And since they didn't have these documents, well, very often they could not have access to these resources in the pandemic due to the lack of information centers and also due to lack of general human resources. We saw that it was very difficult to have access to documents and to be able to have a regulated administrative status. It was basically impossible. And then there's a whole series of problems that were related to food. Since many of the different resources for access to food in the city was closed, and the right to food was not guaranteed. So we had during months, there were different charity canteens. They had to be closed, and they were provided, well, cold picnics, and this was not able to fully cover their food needs. And then to have a place to be able to rest during the day was very complicated, and also to be in contact with social workers, specifically, as we said before, because it was very difficult to have access to the resources. As general conclusions, the impact of the measures to be able to face the COVID-19 provided enhanced distance at a social sphere. So there was enhanced vulnerability of these groups of the homeless and families, homeless families in general. Health is psychological and physical state, and is to also consider social aspects and relationships. We see that the way the emergency was addressed had an impact on the quality of life of these citizens, and it was made more difficult for them to participate, to have access to information, and to communicate. And they were excluded from different housing solutions. So we need to find a way to provide access to full rights to EU mobile citizens that are now homeless. Thank you very much. I've tried to be briefed of all the details that we had, all the data, and I hope that it has been useful. Thank you very much.
There was one question in the chat, but Stephanie will address that. She needs to look up the information and get back on that. So if everybody agrees, I think we will just move to the second session. Andrea, did you want to add something? No, sorry. Yeah, we can continue with the second session, and then we do have time for questions and answers at the end. After we hear from our guest speakers. So for chairing the second session, I invite FEANTSA Deputy Director Ruth Owen to make the introductions and to moderate the discussions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Simona, and thanks to all the speakers in the previous session. It was really rich and interesting, and I think at FEANTSA we're very proud of what's been achieved in the PRODEC project in terms of unpacking a little bit this reality. So our next panel has more of a European level focus. We have 3 speakers to present to us here. The first is Patricia, please correct me if I say your surname wrong, Kazeli from the European Labour Authority. She's a seconded national expert at the Information and Juris Unit. She's an expert on labour mobility, and she's been working with the Commission on how the ELA can support the existing EU and national level services in the area of labour mobility. The aim of her work is to make it easier for Europeans to get the information and support they need when exercising their right to free movement. Dominique Bay is from the Directorate General for Employment and Social Affairs at the European Commission. He's been working there since 1985 on a whole range of issues, and he's currently in charge of actions for the social inclusion of Roma, including their integration in the labour market and the social inclusion of people experiencing homelessness. And our last panelist is Maria Czechowicz, who is Vice Consul at the Consular Section of the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Brussels. She works to support destitute Polish citizens who reside in Belgium, and she has developed various partnerships between the embassy and homeless organisations in Brussels for this purpose, including DIOGENES, who we heard from in the first session. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, who is going to be Dominique. And I believe you have a presentation, Dominique.
Thank you, Ruth. I will use a PowerPoint, which you should see now. So thank you for organizing this event, because it's the topic of homelessness among destitute mobile EU citizens is indeed a worsening and concerning issue. And thank you and congratulations for the first round of presentations, which gave a good illustration of the phenomenon on the ground. And what I would like to do is to, if I can move my screen. Yes, I would like to give a wider overview of the phenomenon, and also to point to some of the factors which explain the development and the worsening of homelessness among EU mobile citizens. So starting from the overall picture, we see that most of EU mobile citizens originate from the southeast of the EU. And this was already pointed to by the previous speakers. And one can see that Romania is clearly the largest country of origin of mobile EU citizens. Now, if we, and it's followed by Italy, Poland, Portugal. If we look at what it means for the countries themselves, so the number of people who leave those countries, one can see that for countries like Romania, Croatia, these numbers are high. I mean, almost 1 Romanian out of 5 lives outside of Romania. And Croatia is close to the same figure. And this is increasing fast. I mean, if we compare the situation in 2010 in blue and yellow 2020, one can see that it is accelerating. Now, if we try to go deeper into this and look at why does it matter in terms of, or why is there a link with homelessness, one can see that there is a difference between countries such as Romania, Portugal, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Greece, where the people who migrate out of the country, the EU mobile citizens out of those countries, tend to be less or are not those with a higher education. In comparison, if we look at countries like Germany, Finland, or France, those who leave the countries are those which have a high education. So there is a difference of profile among those who come from the southeast of the EU towards northwest, that it is largely, or to a large extent, people who have a low education. And this was also pointed to by the previous speakers. And this has an impact, which then will explain why there is a connection with homelessness, is that the employment rate of EU mobile citizens which have low skills for several countries like Bulgaria, Romania, tend to be much lower than those who stay at home. And also among the groups of those who leave the country, those which have who have low skills struggle more to find employment. And in Hungary is an exception in this context, where the people who have low skills tend to find employment outside of Hungary. And we also need to see that, and this is somewhere relatively obvious, that countries in the southeast of Europe, from where most of the EU mobile citizens originate, are the poorest, have the lowest income per person. And these are also countries which are very unequal. So the inequalities are much higher in those countries in the southeast. Poland is an exception in this. And one explanation for this is that the welfare systems in countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia are less effective in addressing poverty at home, meaning that the difference between the before and after social transfers in the countries of origin are limited, are not effective. And if at the other end of the picture, if you look at countries like Slovakia and Czechia, you see that the welfare system is much more effective, and the poverty rate after social transfers is among the lowest within the EU. And that's all may explain also why we don't see so much migration or e-mobility out of countries like Slovakia or the Czech Republic. Now, if we look further at and we focus on the housing situation in the countries of origin, so the southeast of Europe, one can see that, in fact, the housing situation is worse in those countries in terms of overcrowding, and also in terms of housing deprivation in a wider sense. That in blue, these are the countries where people face more difficulties in keeping their house. The homelessness of destitute EU mobile citizens is the symptom, the visible part of a much deeper issue of social exclusion before and after their mobility. So it's among if one looks at the total numbers, there are more than 10 million EU citizens who live in a different country. The number of them who end up in homelessness is much lower. So it means this is what we see is the tip of an iceberg, but it does not cover all of this issue. And one could say that the freedom of movement rules are not the root cause of homelessness. In fact, homelessness or the factors of homelessness came with people who migrate from one country to another one. And I think the point to make is that the directive which regulates the freedom of movement, first, it is setting a minimum standard, a threshold, meaning that countries may always be more generous than the minimum which is defined by the directive. The directive is not a ceiling, it is a threshold. And the second point is that the freedom of movement directive was established is establishing an EU-wide labor market. It is not establishing an EU-wide social protection system. And I think the two should not be confused, because I think part of the discussion has been around this. There is no directive about the social protection that would be the same in all countries. What is established by Directive 2004/38 is the same rights for workers and access to, that's what we heard before, that once you have an employment, a job, then there are not so many difficulties. The difficulties exist for those who do not manage to get employment. So it means that there is a preparation of a reviewed guidance for the directive, which will clarify some unclear aspects of the directive, but there is no plan at this stage to provide new rules or to change the main objective of the directive. So this, I think, had to be clarified at this stage, that if one would wish to tackle the root causes of homelessness, one would have to look at wider policies, education, employment, housing, social policies in the countries of origin, but also in the countries of destination. So this is what I wanted to say to introduce this round of discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominique, and thank you also for sticking very closely to the time. I think you introduced some very interesting sort of contextual data about free movement. I think what we heard from the panelists earlier where indicates that while freedom of movement rules may not be the root cause of homelessness, and it's always very difficult to establish a root cause of homelessness, there are definitely some issues in relation to some of the concepts in the rules and the way that they're applied that push people and keep people into particularly vulnerable situations. And I hope we can discuss a little bit more in detail what the communication could do to address some of that during the panel. And I also would say that I think the data that we heard this morning kind of indicates that people who are facing destitution unfortunately can't necessarily wait for all of the root causes to be addressed. So I'd like to hand over now to Patricia from the European Labour Authority.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you to our hosts, and thank you for the opportunity to present the European Labour Authority and its work. Ella,
hier und ihre Arbeit darzustellen. Es ist eine sehr junge europäische Agentur.
2019. Y bueno, va a acelerar un poco su trabajo de aquí a 2024, pero ya tenemos una serie de actividades en curso y muchas
activities that are more or less related to the topic of today's webinar, which is prevention of destitution and possible homelessness among specifically mobile EU citizens. At this forum, we all very well know a number of factors can lead to homelessness or destitution. Addressing these factors is beyond any one agency or institution, or for that matter, when we talk about mobile EU citizens, even one state. So some of the factors can be addressed at an individual level and other can be addressed at the policy level or the application thereof. During the process of bringing forward ELA's founding regulation and establishing ELA, member states clearly expressed their expectations of the authority, and it was not to provide direct information and services to citizens, but to support them to be able to better enforce applicable legislation for the benefit of workers, employers, and European citizens in general. So in line with its mandate, ELA supports EU mobile workers by supporting member states, for example, by facilitating access to national and EU level sources of information and available services, by facilitating cooperation and exchange of information between member states, for example, on the minimum remuneration, on collective agreements, on types of employment, on social security coordination, etc. And ELA can also mediate in disputes between member states, for example, in the field of social security coordination. ELA can support member states in capacity building regarding enforcement of applicable legislation. ELA can help in tackling undeclared work also by conducting coordinated and joint inspections. It is important here to stress that ELA does not conduct inspections itself because it is not ELA's mandate, but ELA can help with conducting these coordinating activities, which is especially in some sectors very important. And by doing so, by tackling undeclared work, also ELA tries to indirectly tackle homelessness, destitution, etc., because these are all elements that can lead to such occurrences. ELA will also carry out analysis and risk assessments on issues of cross-border labor mobility, and we hope that these analyses will be helpful not only to national level institutions, but also to other EU institutions, agencies, and also non-governmental organizations to think about activities that they could undertake and how we can all work together in prevent or tackle situations that are happening in the labor market and that we would all like to lower in a way. ELA also detects and addresses burning issues in the freedom of movement field. So, for example, this year in 2021, ELA led its first pan-European, first but not last, pan-European campaign. It was dedicated to seasonal work and more specifically seasonal work in agricultural food sector. And it brought together national institutions, EU-level networks, national and EU-level stakeholders, such as organizations of employers and trade unions. Among other activities in the framework of this campaign, we produced several different infographics and leaflets. Basically, it worked like checklists, both for workers in seasonal employment and for their employers, just to remind both sides about their rights and obligations and who can they address if they need or seek more advice or support in any matter. What is important is that these leaflets were available in different formats. So they were available in e-format to be accessible on different media, but also they were readily available for print, so that seasonal workers, especially in the agri-food sector, who are basically in the field and maybe do not have access to internet and such, can so that these leaflets can be distributed to them. The second important thing is that materials were available in all EU languages, but also it could be using Ella's translation facility translated to non-EU languages, because we must not forget that in European labor market, especially recently, and especially in some sectors, such as agri-food sector, we have lots of non-EU nationals who also can be in jeopardy and can be really vulnerable, sometimes even more vulnerable than EU nationals, because you know, they are maybe less eager to seek their rights once in the EU. But here I would like to stress one of the business processes of Ella that has very practical application in preventing destitution and the risk of homelessness, and that's EURES. EURES is a network that is here more than 25 years, and Ella has recently taken over the management of EURES network. It is the network that supports cross-border job mobility, both through job placement and provision of information and counseling to job seekers and employers who wish to benefit from free movement, but also to interested public that would like to get more information about free movement possibilities. EURES services are available throughout the European Economic Area and Switzerland, and across different online and on-site channels, regardless, which is very important to stress, regardless of person status. So to access EURES, to access its counseling and information and even job placement services, it is not necessary that that person has a certain registration status in a country. And what is also important, that EURES services are available through different organizations. So it is not available only through public employment services like it was until 2016, but also to private employment services and a variety of EURES partners such as universities, municipalities, NGOs, etc. So there are a number of partners that work with specific groups of mobile citizens and provide EURES services to them. Through its activities, EURES tackles some of the common risks EU movers can face, and I would stress here lack of information, especially about the country of destination, when it comes to living and working conditions, types of employment, the registration formalities, rights and obligations stemming from social security coordination. So there is a number of information that in order for person's mobility process to be successful, that the person needs to have. EURES tackles this both through EURES portal, which is a multilingual portal that provides information on living and working conditions in all member states, as well as labor market information. So one can get an overview of where are specific professions needed, and when and where maybe there is more than enough workers in specific profession. So maybe one should think about another destination for their endeavors. Also, what we try to tackle through EURES is use of unreliable sources in searching for a job, which can make job seekers subject to frauds, undeclared works, poor living and working conditions, and this can also lead to both destitution, homelessness, and even worse situation, close to well, modern slavery in some situations. And finally, lack of language proficiency. That is very important factor for mobile citizens, because EURES is a multilingual portal, but also a multilingual network of around 1,000 EURES advisors. So there is an advisor for every language, and all of them are accessible in their offices via telephone, email, chats, social media. So EURES really is, where job seekers and workers are. So I would like to close now with just to point out that by managing EURES and coordinating and supporting its activities, ELA also supports fair and safe labor mobility, and this way indirectly tries to prevent occurrences such as destitution and homelessness.
Thank you very much, Patricia. That was a very impressively comprehensive and rapid overview of the relevant work of the ELA in this area. I mean, I think all of those sort of services like capacity building, analysis and risk assessments, burning issues, and services like EURES are really relevant to these discussions. I think one of the challenges when you're talking about people in very vulnerable situations is how to actually connect with them, and maybe that's an area that we can address as the PRODEC project and in discussion with you. Okay, so I would now like to give the floor to our final panelist, who is Maria Czerkowicz from the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Brussels.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event.
Maria, when you introduced yourself at the very beginning, we heard you well, but now you're quite quiet. Is it possible to increase the volume a little bit?
Now it's better, and it's okay. I don't know. I'm not hearing me. Okay, then. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. First of all, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the problem.
Folgendes an Tatsachen aufweisen. Obdachlosigkeit als Problem.
Del sinhogarismo. Bueno, en general en el consulado nos limitamos a los trámites administrativos.
Also support our citizens in the area of so-called consular protection in situation of distress, which may include the cases of being a victim of a crime or an accident, in cases when a person is hospitalized, in case of parental responsibility for minors in transborder disputes. Due to the specific profile of the Polish diaspora in Belgium, we often deal with cases of people who are in conflict with their employee and their workers' rights were infringed. In our consular work, we also support the Polish diaspora in their access to the Polish culture and education. The issue of homelessness could be seen as a minor aspect of our consular work, but it's an important one for two reasons. Firstly, there are often complex cases where collaboration of several people in the consulate is needed. And secondly, with our involvement, we can really make a change in the lives of these people. In my presentation, I will say a bit about our engagement in cases regarding homeless people, Polish citizens in Belgium, and what we can and what we cannot do for them in view of the legal framework of the Polish consular law, and in view of local circumstances. It is generally known that the large number of Polish citizens left Poland after the 2004 EU enlargement in their chase for happiness in so-called old member states. I wish to put the fact in the context. The migration is a sort of the Polish speciality, and due to the turmoil of history, Poles often migrate in the past of the current, and currently there are about 20 million Poles or people with Polish roots living abroad. According to the official data of the Polish Central Statistical Office, in 2020, circa 2,040,000 Poles were temporarily living abroad. In our opinion, there are two main reasons which cause homelessness in case of Polish abroad. Firstly, is often a consequence of working on the black market, illegal work, without being in a social security scheme, and when, for any reason, the job is lost, people have no access to any social or medical coverage. Secondly, the psychological aspect. Poles are too proud to admit a failure, and they feel uneasy about going back home to Poland without any savings. And it's a very strong feeling for many people. On the top of these main causes, there are some other reasons: criminality, lack of support from families, and a good and easy access to social help abroad. Our main practice is to treat each case individually. What we can do and how we can assist is described in the legal framework, and we, as officials, we are bound by legal regulations. In which circumstances we can dealing with cases of homeless people. They get to us directly. They came to request a passport or financial assistance, or they came through social assistance organization which we are in touch. DIOGENES, Barka, Hersham team, the police of Brussels, hospital social divisions, shelters, and families. Which concrete measures we can take in case of homeless people? The first one, we can issue a passport to have an identity document, to have access to medical services, to social assistance, to pensions, to legalize their stay and to have domicile, to have a proof of nationality, to request the search for the lost person. We offer the deposit to the document of at the consulate for free. The second measure we take in cases of homeless people is to organize a return to Poland directly. In case of helpless person with no other means and no family support. The third measure is to organize a return to Poland through social assistance organization Barka. We are getting in touch with Barka to assess the case and the motivation of a person to get the support of Barka shelters in Poland. And we provide some local help. We provide food and some items to the non-governmental organization active in Belgium, which helps Poles in need. We support shelters in Belgium. What do we check in case of homeless person? We check formal circumstances. Does the person have an address in Poland? Which document he or she had before and which consulates were involved in case of person on the move? Does she or he have a document recently issued in Poland? We check if the homelessness is a new situation or is a long-term situation. Priority number one for us is a return to Poland and the chance the person can be covered by the social assistance scheme or support from the family. And to prevent the person from getting back on the street or staying there. following losing a job, following psychiatric episode, following sickness or generally due to the poor health condition, following losing documents or financial means. If a person is on the street accidentally for a while, we immediately take action to help him return to Poland. If a person cannot or does not want to return to Poland, we support him or her in Belgium, but our possibilities are limited, and we can issue a passport, deposit a passport, or can provide a one-time assistance, for example, buying medicine. I will present one or two case study. This is to explain how we will work. There is 3 guys with a drinking problem, 3 unemployed middle-aged men were hired on the market square on the little town in Poland to work in Germany. All 3 found themselves, nobody knows why, in Belgium. The first one, after a couple of days since leaving Poland, with no documents, no money. The second one, after 2 weeks since leaving Poland, in a hospital. And the third one spent almost 6 months living with other Poles, but he did know any language and was not able to find the job, so he came to us. And this is one man, and the other case is the older man who was in hospital. He was homeless since many years. He was working illegally and found himself in a hospital, having serious problem with a leg. The hospital contacted us to help him with obtaining the passports. It would allow him to ask for cost of medical services to be paid by the social assistance. We issued a passport and get in touch with Barca, so he could come back to Poland. And it's 10, and the most of the homeless people are the victims of illegal works, we think, which result in impossibility to regulate the stay, being outside the scope of any social or medical protection, impossibility to have unemployment benefits, impossibility to register to search for a job. These people often do not know the language, so they are vulnerable to be a victim of a fraud, human trafficking. They cannot contact specialized services, trade unions, etc. They cannot have access to psychological support. Support with family formalities, getting out of the illegal work environment and getting to the Belgian social assistance scheme. These are the main challenges for us. Globally, these people need a long-term assistance to get a perspective of a legal status, a legal stay, minimal wage of and then access to rehab and psychological support. And thank you very much.
Difficult realities that the embassy is faced with, and the relatively limited number of options available to support people. Okay, so we now have some time until about 1:25, about 20 minutes for some discussion. I have a few questions that I would like to put to the panelists. I can also see that there is quite a lot of activity in the chat. I had a question that I was going to put to Dominique, but I see he's just answered it in writing. There is a question, and there was already a question on this about housing first and the extent to which that is or isn't a suitable service response for mobile EU citizens. Perhaps we can come back to that one. I'd like to maybe kick off with a question. So we heard from Dominique that the Commission has announced a new communication updating the guidelines on free movement. And I'd like to ask a question for all the panelists, and whoever would like to answer it, please come in. What do you think should be included in that communication to help improve the living conditions of mobile EU citizens who face or are at risk of destitution? Perhaps I could invite Dominique to respond to that one.
Yes, I can just repeat that the Commission has got a mandate to clarify the existing rules. It has a mandate to change the rules. So it will clarify what does it mean to look for a job. What does it mean to be or not to be a burden for the social assistance system, so the social security system. But it's the mandate of the Commission at this stage is not to create a new directive. So it's the same directive. We are talking about guidelines to interpret an existing directive. So it's to support member states when they have to apply the rules set by the directive.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's well understood, but I think what we heard in this morning's presentations, for example, from Maurizio, is that some clarification on some of these core concepts like worker, genuine chances to get a job, they are currently vaguely defined, and the disparity between member states does create extra and sometimes impossible obstacles for more vulnerable EU citizens. So I think that sounds really hopeful from our perspective. That I don't know if any of the other speakers would like to come in on that.
Since I come from, it's not a policy-making body, but rather the body that supports member states in enforcement. I would leave these particular questions for other speakers to address, and just maybe to point out that member states made pretty clearly that labor law and definitions are under their mandate. So. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that will need lots of talks and discussions and persuasions from different actors to take.
Okay, thank you. Bea, I think did you raise your hand? Bea from Arrels? Yeah.
Sí. Bueno, a ver, no sé si respondo exactamente a la pregunta, pero sí que, a ver, sí que es verdad.
Question directly, but it is true that specifically in Barcelona, in Spain, we see that the EU mobile citizens, well, they have a very difficult time to access the labor market. So we're not talking about a definition of worker or not, if this is adequately defined, but rather how can they have access to a labor market that allows for the social integration of this group? It's very difficult due to health issues, sometimes lack of training, even digital access. So it's a proposal, maybe a bit crazy, but well, we have this situation when we work with EU mobile citizens and general migrants, no EU migrants. So third country nationals in homelessness situation. So I'm talking about these cases. They have the possibility to be regularized. So to have a stable administrative situation through humanitarian reasons or due to humanitarian reasons, but these reasons are not contemplated in the case of EU mobile workers, EU mobile citizens. So as I said, there are some very specific reasons, family reunification, for example, work or study or something. So the possibility to take into account the vulnerability of these citizens is not contemplated in the directive. And this is the issue that we have. Maybe could this be taken into account, this concrete situation, as a criteria to interpret the directive, since a new interpretation is being considered? I hope I explained myself clearly. So for humanitarian reasons, for vulnerable population.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of one of the critical questions coming from today's discussion. That it's, you know, people find themselves in. Yeah, Dominique.
Yeah, maybe I could, I think, clarify, because it's a discussion which may go into circles forever. If you are a non-EU citizen and you come in a country and you ask for asylum, if you are granted refugee status, you have the same rights as a national, and you are entitled to do this, to do and to receive the same. If you are an EU citizen, you cannot apply for asylum, so you cannot be granted refugee status. So the status of intra-EU mobile citizen is not giving the same rights as that of migrant given asylum. And this is, I think, the major difference. That explains why, if you are EU mobile citizen, if you don't have employment, you do not have access to the social protection support, which is what is discussed today. It's the barriers are not so much to access the labor market, because this is open, but it is to benefit from the social protection support if you don't manage to get employment within 3 months, which is the core issue. But for this, the directive on free movement is not the one to change. It's something else.
Okay, thank you. I want to cover some of the chat questions because we have a huge number with our active participants. So I think what I'll do, if it's okay with the panelists, is suggest 2 or 3 questions to different speakers, and then give them the floor, so that there's a bit of thinking time as well, perhaps. So one of the questions, I think this one would be to Maria, is a question: is it possible to orientate Polish citizens directly to the consulate, e.g. to help them to return to Poland or to arrange their legal status? There's a question to the Commission: is there a timeline for the new communication, and will there be an open consultation? And then there's a question on EU funding, whether there are any specific EU funding instruments to help with this issue. Okay, so that would be a question for Maria, and perhaps 2 questions for Dominique, and then perhaps we'll come back to this question. There's a question on the digital divide and how mobile EU citizens who experience homelessness or destitution are affected by barriers to accessing digital information, and this original question of housing first. So I'll give the floor first to Maria and then to Dominique.
And I think, sorry, Ruth, Andrea from DIOGENES could answer the digitalization question.
For the question concerning homeless Polish citizens directly, if they can came to consulate. Yes, they can, but it's rather it's better that they came with somebody from the organization they have contact from sometimes. Then it's better to us to recognize the possibilities to return to Poland and to verify the formal possibilities to help these people, this person or these people. Then we are open like a normal consulate, and they could came, but it's rather complicated in the case of COVID regulation, because we cannot have too many people at once. And but it's better to contact us before by mail, and we can arrange some kind of meeting or something other possibilities. Thank you.
Thanks. Dominique, perhaps I can give you the floor on the question in relation to the communication and in relation to funding.
Yes, briefly. So the consultation already took place in 2020. And now we are in the final stage of drafting, so it will be published in 2022. But there is no more consultation. The consultation took place already in the past. About funding, at national level, it's the EU, ESF mainly, ESF Plus, which is the main funding which can be used for actions which support the integration of people in the labor market, essentially.
Okay, thanks. So the PRODEC project is funded by EPIM, and I think I would just also signal that maybe some of the panelists today have some interesting experiences in terms of using EU funding, and especially the FEAD program in Germany, for example, to address the needs of this target group. So I think that brings us on to Andrea, who could perhaps answer the question about the digital divide, maybe say a word or two more about Housing First, because it's come up again, although I know you did answer one question in the chat.
Yes, indeed. Well, I will start with the digital, inclusion or divide. So in the case where a person is being accompanied and is working alongside street workers from DIOGENES or other field associations, it's indeed much easier because those workers have access to computers, telephones, etc. But a majority of people living in the streets, being homeless, don't have mobile phones, don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have, access to emails, etc. And even before the pandemic, it was sometimes necessary in order to access information or even to access services, even just to check the schedules. If you wish to go somewhere, but you don't know what are the schedules, what are the other means to check them than by going on the internet, which is not an option for many people. And the pandemic with, working from home has further created a divide, because more and more people from crucial associations such as the public services, administrations, etc., are working from home and thus only work via email. So if you have a street worker alongside you, that's fine, but if you don't, then you don't have access to that. So you are completely left out. And even with the accompaniment of social workers, sometimes it can, being emails back and forth, and that takes time, and sometimes people don't have time to wait, especially when it's regarding health issues or issues relating to children. So yes, I hope that sums up. I don't have much time to go into further detail, but I will briefly touch on housing first versus issue as project per se as well. So housing first was really designed with the idea that it would create a possibility to access housing for people who are the most vulnerable and the further away from accessing traditional housing. Those are people who often have several problems, be it alcohol and
Andrea, you've frozen. Okay, I think we'll come back to Andrea if she unfreezes, but
access. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, we lost you for a few seconds. You froze.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my connection is not the best, but yeah. So and also importantly too, housing first was designed for people who already have some type of status. So maybe not a full permit for residency, but who maybe have at least an e-card or something like that. And obviously, when we're talking about mobile EU citizens who are homeless, many of those don't have any type of legal status, so they can't access housing first. And moreover, when we're talking especially about Roma communities and Roma families, they don't demonstrate any of the problems we cited above, or in a very small quantity. So alcohol or drug dependency, mental or physical health problems, and so they're not really the ideal candidates for housing first. That is why I think one of the reasons why Issue was created with several other partners across different sectors was to address the need to find shelter and temporary, but still at least 6 months to give enough time and with ad hoc support to as a stepping stone for people to be able to have better access to a legal administrative status. I hope that sums it up.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. I think the core of the message perhaps is like, housing first in a programmatic sense might not be the right answer, but the principle to stabilize people's housing situation as much as possible as part of a package to support them towards inclusion is definitely not being contested by you, I don't think. So we've had a question about Brexit and from Berlin, raising the issue that some UK citizens finding themselves in vulnerable situations and just asking whether other organizations have experience of that. I think maybe I can say briefly from FEANTSA, and Simona, please jump in. I think we're like, it's a very early stage and maybe some anecdotal reports, but not a very clear picture. But it's definitely something that FEANTSA and some of our partners in this area want to work on going forward. And as a kind of next phase of EPIM, we want to work on the situation of EU mobile citizens who are vulnerable in the UK in the context of the withdrawal agreement, but also like the other way around too. So I think that's a conversation that we can keep going. I'd like to ask a question to Dominique, which is that the European Commission has just launched a European platform on combating homelessness, or launched it this summer, and it's just had its first meeting. One of the areas that we hear coming up as a thematic area of interest in that context is free movement and homelessness. And I just want
Stichwort Freizügigkeit und Obdachlosigkeit.
Compartir algunas reflexiones para apoyar a las organizaciones de los Estados miembros.
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, the platform has been launched. And so just to clarify for those who are less familiar, it is really a platform, so where various stakeholders, so EU institutions, member states, and NGOs can meet and work together. So a webinar like today could be part of the platform. It is an activity which is focused on homelessness, looking at a specific angle of it, which is EU mobile citizens. So one could say that this webinar could get the label EU platform on homelessness, on combating homelessness. And so the platform will allow for this type of work together. Today, we have a set of partners, but we have the Polish national authorities with us, EU institutions, civil society, and definitely EU mobile citizens who end up in homelessness is likely to be an issue discussed and worked on at the platform, because it has obviously an EU dimension which no country alone can solve. And the way the platform will function will, to a large extent, depend on how its members want it to function. So there is no scheme defined by the Commission from the top. It is a collective work, and the work program of the platform will be adopted for 22-23 in next February. But for the time being, we invited all members of the platform, including FEANTSA, to submit proposals for what should be included in the work program of the platform. And I repeat again, a project like PRODEC could be under this political umbrella provided by the platform.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so I would just like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. Maybe to underline that this is a piece of work that's going to move forward in FEANTSA, and we know we're going to follow up on this round of the PRODEC project. Simona, I don't know if you would like to say anything to finish off.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everybody. Just would like to say as way of conclusion that it has been really, really interesting to work on the report during the past 2 years, and take the opportunity to thank our members and partners because they've been putting a lot of work into this during a pandemic. So really thank you for the great work. And we will continue, as Ruth is saying, to advocate on the rights of mobile EU citizens in destitution. We hope to see in the new communication at least some of the things that were mentioned today being addressed, because we do believe that that would make a difference in people's lives. So we are very grateful for the participation of Dominique and of Patricia, but also from the Vice Consul from the Polish Embassy. We will try to develop the collaboration in the future. And it's just to say that EPIM has announced a third round of funding that will be open next year. We will apply, and we hope to be able to continue this with support from them, which has been really great to be able to do in the past years. So yes, thank you so much, everyone, for being with us until the end. We remain available for questions via email, and hope to see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of December and happy holidays.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Hi.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.